Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the iPad 3rd generation and see how this iPad holds up in 2023. Now, what's funny is this iPad is actually 11 years old this year, which is so crazy. It doesn't even feel like it's been that long, but because of these iPads, I kind of do think Apple during this generation kind of learned a lot, and I think the iPad 3 was very, very interesting for sure. It brought a couple cool things to the table, but ultimately I still think it was pretty much just an iPad 2 kind of recycled, and I think a lot of people would probably end up agreeing with some statements like that. If you want to pick up some iPads, I would recommend this here though. Links will be down in the description. You can definitely get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPad 3rd generation, we actually did have two different models. So this was actually the first, I think, group of iPads that had the Wi-Fi and cellular models with them, which was actually pretty cool. So this iPad ended up having a 9.7-inch display on the front. Now, I kind of do think that the specific, iPad display was pretty decent because it was, I believe, the first iPad to bring a Retina display, which was honestly very cool. So this was something that actually had, kind of a cool, design to it. It wasn't that much different, I guess, from the iPad 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. But this iPad definitely with that newer Retina design was a better display, and it definitely looked better overall. And that's kind of the better, I guess that was the biggest thing that kind of changed with this specific device. You also had pretty thick bezels around it, which, it's kind of accustomed to. A lot of people know that these iPads have bigger bezels compared to other devices. So it's completely normal in my opinion. And funny enough, again, you did have that front camera on this iPad that came with the 2nd gen iPad. You had the home button and everything, and still pretty much everything looked kind of the same as the iPad 2. But I was kind of happy that they did kind of make some improvements here. Now, the iPad at the bottom had the Lightning port, which was cool. It also had a headphone jack at the very top as well, which was very, very awesome. Now, on the back, we did have our aluminum back on this iPad, which, it still feels very premium. It still looks very good too. Like, it doesn't really look like an 11-year-old device. I mean, if you went back to 2012 and you went, 11 years before that to like 2001, 2002, those were some pretty, it's pretty crazy how much technology has gotten better. And every time I think about that kind of stuff, it kind of makes me emotional. Now, on top of that, not really too much else on the outside. Again, we had that Wi-Fi and cellular model, which was cool. So the fact that we actually had that thing was actually pretty awesome. Now, another funny thing with this iPad is that apparently to Wikipedia, only 7 months after this iPad was officially revealed, it kind of got discontinued. So apparently the 4th generation iPad came right after this thing. And apparently this is the iPad that has the shortest lifespan of any iOS product. And actually, it looks like any iOS product, it has the shortest lifespan. So that was a very interesting thing. And I think the main reason why they did this was mostly because of that charging port. That's kind of what this article kind of states too. They just wanted to get rid of that charging port and just go straight for Lightning. And I think that this was probably the best approach they had. So funny enough, this has the shortest lifespan of any iOS device, which is very interesting. Now, in terms of the camera setup, again, this wasn't, I don't think, a big difference coming from the previous iPad. So with the iPad 2, that had a okay camera for what it was. I think at that time was probably pretty decent, but in this day and age, again, not so much. But with this iPad, 5 megapixel autofocus camera on the back, and you did have a VGA camera on the front. Now, I like having this type of camera set up, and back in 2012, you have to kind of keep in mind there probably weren't a lot of different, devices out there that had a front and back camera. I know when the iPad 2 came out and the iPad 1st gen came out, I think the iPhone 4 was probably already out. So I'm glad they kind of had that capability already by that point. You could do video calling over Wi-Fi, for the front camera. You can take photos and whatnot with the back camera. And I think that kind of stuff is really cool. And it's kind of needed when it comes down to it. Is it the craziest thing ever? No, but I'm sure at that moment that was probably one reason why people went ahead and upgraded, at least from the 1st generation iPad to this one. There may have been some other reasons of why people upgraded, but those are kind of some big things and big reasons why some people would upgrade from one device to the other. Now, if you're planning on using this camera nowadays, you're probably not going to have that good of a time with it. But at that time, you have to remember a lot of people were obsessed with this type of camera. So in terms of that and in terms of the camera department, that's kind of how it sums up here. There's really not too much else to kind of hate on here. Now, in the software department, again, this thing started off with iOS 5.1, and according to Wikipedia, this was the iPad with the shortest lifespan, but it did not have only 1 or 2 iOS updates. this thing lasted for a long period of time in terms of software. So this thing started off with iOS 5.1. It did get upgradable to iOS 9.3.5. So this thing lasted for many, many years. It's not just like 1 year this thing lasted. This phone, I believe, lasted as long as about an iPhone 4S. So again, that's a good thing. I'm glad that device ended up, lasting as long as basically like an iPhone 4S. And iOS 9 wasn't a horrible version of software. It just really wasn't optimized for a lot of different devices. That's why iOS 10, I truly do believe, was probably one of the better updates Apple has ever made. So again, if you're in this situation where you want to go ahead and basically have a very solid device, quite potentially this is probably not the best one anymore, considering it's very outdated. And this is basically the main reason why I wouldn't recommend buying a specific device like this anymore. It's because it is fairly outdated when it comes down to it. When this device came out, I'm sure it was great, but as of this point, it's just not really doing too well because it's going to be outdated with software. So those types of things, again, are just big things to keep in mind. And again, if you're planning on buying this type of iPad, I would highly recommend avoiding it just because it is outdated. I mean, it's been outdated for so many years. And on top of that, a lot of the applications are probably not going to work anymore either. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In the performance side, this thing did have that Apple A5X chip inside with 1GB of RAM. Now, I don't know if this was the first A-blank-X chip inside, and I believe this was the first iPad to bring 1GB of RAM as well. So I think those are some big things to keep in mind here. And with this iPad, I do remember using it a few years ago, and this was, I think, when it was still kind of supported with software. So maybe it was like when iOS 11 was out, or maybe iOS 12 was out, but this thing you could still install applications on. And I remember using this thing, and it honestly did not feel that bad. It didn't feel like a super slow device, but you can definitely tell it's outdated, especially on iOS 9. I would argue that iOS 11, as faulty as it was actually a pretty big update for the most part. So when you look at this device nowadays, it definitely is outdated, but I remember when iOS 11 came out, it was still fairly modern. iOS 9 I think was pretty important, but since iOS 11, our devices have looked so different for the most part, and those types of things are big things to keep in mind as well. So when it comes down to it, I mean, you can't really do too much on it now, but I'm sure back then, I mean, this was still a moment where people thought iPads were just bigger iPhones. But slowly after this, that's when people started comparing iPads more in line with MacBooks, and I would even argue iMacs rather than iPhones. So that kind of covers it up there. In the battery life segment, I mean, this thing had a massive size battery inside of it, an 11,560 milliamp-hour battery. That is easily one of the bigger size batteries you could probably ever find inside of an iPad. Well, I take that back. I mean, you can definitely find bigger, but for that time, that was a massive size battery. And those are just some other reasons why Apple did just such a good job with kind of certain iPads back then. And in this case, I feel no different. It's a very solid iPad for sure. So when it comes down to it, at no means I would say get this iPad. I mean, it's completely not worth it. It's it's just going to give you too many issues. There's really no reason to picking it up. But I will tell you, for that time, it was very interesting. It was a very interesting device. I just probably would not recommend buying this iPad at all anymore. But the choice is yours. I mean, this thing's not really usable. I would recommend at the very least buying an iPad 5. It's only 2 generations newer than this thing, but that's still kind of supported with software, so I'd probably recommend going down that road, but that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.